All right, what's going on, people? It's me. I'm back. It's just me today. Or, well, not entirely, as you guys can see. I have another co-host today. What's going on, Jimbob? Good to have you back, dude.
Yeah, I'm good, man. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, yeah. It's funny because I had this bit planned with Chris where it's like the last time that we were on, well, the three of us were on, it's funny because we were gonna do, it was more of like just to talk about Studio Ghibli in general, but then it kind of wasn't that. It kind of ended up turning into a conversation about Spirited Away, arguably their most popular movie. So it was just funny how that turned out, but that's not the case as is today.
Okay, not a problem. So, Princess Mononoke today.
Yeah, we're covering Princess Mononoke, which I don't know what your thoughts are on this movie. I mean, well, we're obviously going to get into that, but
right.
I've never watched this movie before, and I already kind of have a bias towards movies that came out the year that I was born, which is 97, obviously, which is not a great year for movies, to say the least. I'm just going to get that right off the bat. Like, you got a few gems that year, because that's the year you got Boogie Nights that year, you got Good Will Hunting, you got LA Confidential, Men in Black, Con Air, Jackie Brown, Hercules, few good ones, but for the most part, it's not the best year overall when it comes to movies. No. But
I want to think so now, because I mean, it was pretty much the year of like pure 90s cheese. I mean, you said Men in Black. And yeah, there's a lot of goofy stuff in that. I mean, have you seen how bad the CGI has aged over the years?
Yeah, well, not to mention the fact that just the overall goofiness, if you just want to talk about it from a superhero standpoint, it's like Batman and Robin, Spawn, and Steel all that year. I'm not proud, to say the least. I'm not proud. But what's interesting is that the other thing, too, is that, like, outside of Hercules, like, there aren't that many, like, animated movies that are talked about. Like, because that was the whole thing with the 90s, right? Is the 90s you had, like, the one big Disney animated movie a year. And it's not like now where it's like there's, like, 3 to 4 animated movies made a year now. There wasn't a whole lot of diversity. And Studio Ghibli, obviously, was still like kind of on the up and up, you know, like they had a pretty big commercial success with My Neighbor Totoro. But then this movie comes out in Japan, and and literally, no joke, this movie was the highest grossing movie in Japan when it was when it was released. It became the highest grossing film in Japan when it was released in 97. It held Japan's box office record for domestic films, at least until Spirited Away was released. And so before we even get into the actual movie itself, I feel like that spells out a lot already.
Oh, you're telling me. I mean, if you look back on a movie like Princess Mononoke and the animation in particular, like that can rival Disney, if you ask me. I mean, so many
absolutely
into it. And just the other day, I was watching The Seven Deadly Sins, if you've heard of that.
I have.
And basically, Miyazaki, the sort of director, if you watch scenes in Seven Deadly Sins, you'll see like a whole room full of people, right? And you'll only see like the first 2 people, like the main characters, having a conversation. They're the only ones that are moving. But if you look at this film, there's a whole room full of people, and it's like Miyazaki decided to animate every single character, even if it's just the slightest bit of movement, which makes it more realistic, if you ask me.
Before we even get into the actual plot, just again, so that, like, literally the thing that I wrote first when I wrote my review for this movie, when I finished yesterday, there's a lot that's involved. Like, Miyazaki does not go the cheap route when it comes to animation at all. No. I think it's safe to say. But it's also, like I said, it's a thing where obviously a lot of animation has always been regarded as like a kid's medium or forum per se. But obviously with his movies, he uses them to get across a lot of very, very mature themes. And the thing that I love is that in every frame of animation in all of the 3 of his movies that I've seen so far, because this is the 3rd one that I've seen after Spirited Away and The Wind Rises, there is not a single minute where there is not some motion of activity, some little small detail, even in a scene where it's literally, like you said, just people sitting around talking or people just moving in a town square. There is detail put into like every single frame, and it's uncanny to witness. And yeah.
No, I know what you mean. I mean, just watching it the other day, I mean, it's my first time watching it as well.
Really? See, that's interesting, because I feel like you would have watched it. You know, you being the Studio Ghibli guy and all.
Oh, I know, yeah. I don't know. I just never got around to it eventually. And I thought, you know what? Watching it just the other day, it's already a contender for probably the best animated film that I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, Spirited Away was up there. But after seeing this and understanding what sort of director Miyazaki is, well, I mean, while doing the podcast with you and Chris the other month, sorry.
Yeah, trust me, time has become non-existent in today's day and age. You're excused for that.
Yeah. So, I learned so much just from listening to you two talk, and I understand the deep messages that Miyazaki goes for now. And I noticed 3 extremely big ones in here, if you want to hear them.
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
Okay. So the first one I noticed is humans will pretty much kill anything that they don't that they don't understand, or if they feel threatened by it.
Pretty par for the course. That's also been explored a lot, obviously, in American films.
Yeah. So obviously you've got Ashitaka, I think his name is.
Yes.
He's the one caught in the crossfire of it all. He's like, okay, we're not all so different, which is a really powerful message to go off of as well. And the second one I noticed was what happens if nature fights humanity back, which I think is probably the biggest one he was going for.
Yes.
And the third one, animal cruelty.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of it was all mashed together beautifully, and I just picked up on it a lot quicker than I thought I would.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, it's like once you see one, it's like the thing that I love too is that he's not overly complex about it, and it never feels like he's talking down to you with his messages, which I feel like is something that is a trap that he could easily fall into, but he never does. So, like, just to basically break down the premise of this, the film follows our main character, Ashitaka, who in the opening scene saves his village from a rampaging boar that's possessed by this demon spirit. But as a result, he's touched by it. In the process, he's cursed, and now he has to go on this journey in order to find a way to lift the curse, and ends up stumbling into this feud that's going on between this human village, the Ironworks, run by this what do you even call her? Like, I guess like the lady of the village, like the ruler of the village, Lady Eboshi, who is in the process fighting off samurai from the evil emperor of Japan, who kind of really isn't even a character. He's kind of just like ancillary off-screen forces, and the forces of the forest, that being the multiple god animals that live in the forest. You know, you have the wolf tribe and the Princess Mononoke, who the odd thing is that, like, even though she's referred to as Princess Mononoke, it's not her actual name. The character's name is San, and also the boar tribe as well that resides in that forest. And he kind of finds himself caught in like this really interesting struggle between them that, as you pointed out, kind of touches and alludes to all those different messages. So, like I said, real quick, before you get into it, because I'm really glad that you brought those messages up, because again, as we said, Miyazaki is a guy, he never makes a movie unless he is making it for a reason. And on our last episode with Spirited Away, I dropped a couple of Miyazaki quotes that he said when he was making this movie. So as you said, the central theme was environment, which was a big thing that he was trying to focus on. And the interesting thing is that the critics Michelle J. Smith and Elizabeth Parsons said that the film makes heroes of outsiders in all identity politics categories, I can read, and blurs the stereotypes that usually define such characters, you know, such as in the case of the deer god's destruction of the forest. And that's something that I found really interesting, because I'm really glad that you brought up the idea of humans killing everything that they touch, because what I found interesting about this movie that was kind of different from a few of these movies before, because like I said, it's a theme that's been tackled in a lot of American movies beforehand. You know, the idea of humans kind of being this inherent enemy to nature and constantly trying to conquer what it is that they don't understand. And as a result, like, you kind of see them getting screwed over. But the thing that I've noticed is that, again, in a lot of those movies, it's usually always one-sided, and nature is kind of like always just like an innocent bystander, you know, and as a result, there's always the emphasis put on the humans. But what I like that this movie did a little bit differently is this movie showed that wasn't really the case. Like, near the end, the humans were like getting a little bit prideful and a little bit big for their britches, but for the most part, they were really just conquering the forest so that they could like continue to expand and like protect what it is that they had, because the Ironworks was established as like one of the main strongholds that was resisting like the emperor, you know, the evil emperor's forces as he was like marching over the land. And also it showed that like the forest gods, they weren't all like fun and games either. Like, they're all kind of about survival, and they would obviously defend what was theirs, but I kind of liked how there was like moral gray on both sides. That's not something that I usually see in these types of stories.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well, because there's kind of like a boundary between humans are really shitty people, and maybe they're not so bad at the same time, and it goes for the animals as well. And the fact that these animals are more human than animals, they've evolved over the years. I mean, a human would literally look at something like that in real life and think, oh, okay, that scares the shit out of me. I'm going to go kill it to protect what's mine. And the animals are just thinking the same. So really, as you said, there's a boundary between the two of them. And no one's really the villain here, if you really think about it, which is fascinating to me. Yeah,
definitely. Like, the whole thing is that obviously the Lady Eboshi character, she is very clearly the antagonist, but like when you meet her, you're like, she's kind of a badass, you know. She's leading like this rebel force. You see them, they're fending off these wolves that are attacking them. She's like she's like created like this whole new type of like weaponry system that she's included into the village, is like giving them like a fighting chance, to like with the muskets and everything. And just her character in general, like, she's a total badass. So she's got total control over everyone, but she's not like super fascist. She's like kind of relaxed. She's got a personality, but she also knows to throw down. And also kind of love how like just like you've got like the ancillary, like again, the side characters with how much detail Miyazaki puts in them, with like all the women of the village and how kind of like they've like kind of like got like a little bit of an ego now because like they're led by a woman. I actually found that really fascinating, the fact that you could have all of that detail in this movie and they never once draw attention to it. I really appreciated that. And it really kind of killed me when you saw Eboshi like kind of giving way to those spies at the end and saying, oh, we got to kill the deer god, you know, we got to prove ourselves. And I'm like, no, don't do that. You're such a compelling character. I like you. Why? And I really like that. Other thing too is how I like how that factored into like I got to make sure I pronounce this right because it is Ashitaka, that's right. Ashitaka struggle is, I like how I like how every person that met Ashitaka, they just kind of respected him, even if he wasn't necessarily on their side. Like as soon as he came back to the villagers at the end in order to try and like save the day and everything, like all the villagers were just like automatically for him, even though like the spies didn't necessarily like him. Literally to the point where the villagers ended up ganging up on the spies and ended up like helping him free the one wolf so that they could go and find Lady Eboshi before she killed the deer god. Now, besides obviously the incredible statements on nature and obviously it being unlike most types of movies like this, obviously with the whole nature struggle. Another big thing that I noticed is that obviously it's kind of impossible to talk about any movie that's made in Japan without referencing, of course, the great Akira Kurosawa. I don't remember if I mentioned him specifically on the last episode that we had. But
I don't remember, but yeah, go ahead.
But what I found really interesting is that, again, so far, the thing that I've liked about each of Miyazaki's movies that I've seen so far is that each one of them are different. You know, Wind Rises is kind of a traditional biopic with a little bit of surrealism in it. Spirited Away is an 80s dark fantasy. But this movie to me was like probably, I don't know if this was Miyazaki's intention or if it was just like a subconscious choice or like he was just doing it and it just happened to turn out this way. This was the most I found him kind of emulating, that's the word I'm going to use here, Kurosawa, because like the wide sweeping landscapes, the kind of traditional hero struggle, you know, almost like the Western-esque backdrop, you know, of like this small village having to fend off this larger forest that comes right out of Magnificent Seven, you know? So I just was wondering like if you kind of got that sense the way that I did.
Yeah, I did actually. And another thing it kind of reminds me of as well. Okay, the movie Pocahontas, this is back onto the subject of Disney.
Right.
Basically, Pocahontas is about the British who want to take over the Native Americans' land. And this movie kind of reminded me of that as well. It's kind of like these humans want to take over, you know, the animals' land because it's all landscape and people will just destroy landscape to build whatever the hell they want. And I just got Pocahontas vibes from it. It was really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. But I think the reason why I go with Kurosawa specifically, like I've seen a couple of movies. I've seen Rashomon and I've seen Throne of Blood. I think those are the only two because I still somehow haven't seen Seven Samurai. But again, like just the idea of like Kurosawa was obviously a guy that like really liked to go for like those big wide nature shots, you know. The stories themselves were all like kind of weirdly enough like traditional American Western because that was the whole thing about Kurosawa. Kurosawa loved Westerns and so he just basically like remade them as Japanese epics. And then the irony of that is that all the American directors that would come out like the 60s and 70s would like unintentionally emulate Kurosawa style. So you kind of saw this like weird circular motion happening throughout as it like bounced back and forth. But, you know, specifically, obviously, with Throne of Blood being one of the biggest influences for George Lucas with Star Wars. And what I found really interesting is, again, like the wide landscape shots, like just how every frame of how it's animated is just so pristine. Like even with like the wind wisping over the grass, again, it's like I have to tell myself that I'm watching an animated movie. That's how in-depth and detailed it gets. But specifically with Kurosawa, again, with his kind of Western take, he always wants to go for the underdog. And I like how Ashitaka, again, is an underdog, really. He's a guy who started out, weirdly enough, on a quest kind of just for himself. He just wants to cure himself, right, of this curse that he got defending his village, you know, a very selfless act. You know, he's introduced as like a pretty standard, you know, just kind of everyday man. And then as he goes and he finds himself and he finds that he ends up becoming part of something much bigger than himself. I just found that really interesting, but also how the struggle that he goes through in a weird way almost gets away from him, because the thing is that we never see him go back to his village. We never see him return to his point of origin. And then when he's finished, he doesn't obviously get the girl at all. Kassan, obviously the whole thing that she says is that she's like, yeah, you still ended up helping the humans in a way. And so screw you, I'm staying in the forest. He's like, all right, I guess I'll stay in the Ironworks, and I guess we can meet up, do that whole once a year thing that happens. So I kind of just found that really interesting.
No, I suppose, again, if you think about it, the fact that it's so realistic, in real life, the guy doesn't always get the girl, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes you don't see things unfold, but I do get what you're saying. Like, he never went back to his village in the end. You don't get to see that bit unfold. Doesn't get to see his old friends again. Like, hey, look, I'm cured now.
Yeah, no, it's not that type of a story. But again, like how it's funny because I feel like in a more traditional narrative that would become a little that would probably like annoy some people. But for this narrative, it works completely because again, the story ultimately grows larger than the character itself, and I don't think it's something that you really see in a lot of Western media. You know, kind of the idea always is that it starts with a traditional character, the world is already set up, and it's kind of usually when it's done right, they'll usually kind of interact until the main character's gone through some sort of arc, and then the world for the most part might change, it might not. But here it's like, no, it's almost like the character becomes involved in this entirely new world, and then as a result, once it influences him, he does influence it, and he does influence it back. It's like a real give and take. It's really interesting. It's one of the things that I absolutely loved about The Last Airbender, you know? Now, the other theme, obviously, that we talked about is, you know, the moral ambiguous conflict between, you know, mankind's growth and development and nature's need for preservation, and how we really see that, like, come to odds in this, and we don't really know if we could pick a side because again, the problem is that for the most amount of times, again, you get like something like a Fern Gully where the humans are so obviously the antagonists that it's like you don't even see them for most time, and most of the time they're just like dumb humans who are being manipulated by the chaos spirit, you know, voiced gleefully by Tim Curry. But here it's like you see the humans and like they feel mostly just like, you know, real people, just peasants. That's the whole thing, because that's the whole thing about the Ironworks is they are established as a village that is specifically for outsiders. Like they take in all the outsiders who can't fit in, you know, like that's the thing. They establish that most of the women there are former prostitutes, which again, the fact that that's in an animated movie is kind of awesome, you know, and like you get like all these kind of like injured men, all these people who just like want like some form of a new life outside of like the current regime, you know? So you do end up rooting for these guys, even though again, they are the evil humans that are uprooting like the forest spirits.
Yeah. So you kind of like toss and turn between who exactly do you root for? Like, do I follow these humans who aren't all that bad, they just want to make a life for themselves, or do I side with these animals who are clearly getting like their home teared down,
right?
But have like bad and good motives on both sides,
right? Yeah, and specifically with the yeah, but specifically with the animals too. I mean, you want to talk about some great designs. I mean, again, we talked back and forth about the animation, but like specifically, like I love how like you to get the different creatures of the woods and, you know, like how they kind of have their own hierarchy that they've evolved. You know, obviously with the wolves, it's the hunters, you know, and the boars, they're primarily the herbivores. You know, that's kind of like why to me it's like really depressing when you see that they're the primary fighting force and that they just get blown to smithereens when they fight. It's one of those situations where you kind of see it's like you see the kind of the renegade rebel force and you're rooting for them to win because they're the underdog, but then you see what they're up against and you kind of just feel bad for them because you're like, oh, they're not winning, not at all.
Yeah, humans bring out the big guns and that's it. The bulls are screaming.
Pretty much. And then, you know, you get the apes that are kind of like hanging over everything. They're kind of like the scavengers, just like the commentators. They don't really want to get involved in everything, but you know, obviously the whole thing about movies is that there's a lot of symbolism involved. There's a lot of metaphors involved. And I was kind of wondering like what you think, like what I thought actually an interesting kind of metaphor involved with the wolves was. It's something that I didn't kind of realize at first, but as I was watching the movie more, I kind of saw this where the three wolves, I believe they established are the last of the wolf tribe because we don't see any other wolves in the movie. And though it's never mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I'm pretty sure that like they are the last of their kind, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was no other wolves in the entire film, of what I know anyway, and I would have read up about it. There's nothing that mentions anymore, so I think you're right, just the three of them. Right,
so what was interesting to me, and I was wondering if, again, because usually you see American films usually pull out influences from foreign films, you know, very rarely do we see foreign films pull from American films, but my first thought that I went to, and it's funny because I'm really not the biggest fan of this movie, but I thought that this stance really stood out to me the most is The Last of the Mohicans. Have you ever seen that one?
I haven't now.
Okay, so it's a Michael Mann film. Again, Michael Mann had one of the most legendary runs in the 90s ever. He had Last of the Mohicans in 92, Heat in 95, The Insider in 99, and one other in 97 that I'm totally forgetting, and it's gonna kill me when I actually remember what it is. But yeah, Michael Mann, really, really great 90s director. And Last of the Mohicans is interesting because it's based on a book where it's set during the American Revolution, and the last three of this one Native American tribe have to protect these what's it called? These white colonists from a rival Native American tribe that wants to see them dead. But the whole thing about it is that it's only technically two of them that are, in this Mohican tribe. The one of them is actually played by Daniel Day-Lewis. He's the main character of them, and he's actually adopted because he was adopted by them when he was a baby. But they are now like the last of their kind, And at the end of the movie, you see the one of them, which is actually the son. It's three of them. It's a dad, and then you have his biological son. They're the last of the Mohicans, and then you have Daniel Day-Lewis, who's the adopted one. And at the end, you see the son actually die. And so by that time, the dad is now the official last of the Mohicans. And I found that really as kind of like a weird, interesting comparison / metaphor here, where the thing with the wolves is that I kind of find this like really interesting relationship that this girl has formed, because supposedly, again, you have to assume it based on what's presented to you, but these three wolves are the last of their kind. And when the mother wolf dies, when, the lead boar, Okatu, right? That's its name, Okatu, I think. Yeah. Becomes consumed by a demon, and it kind of sacrifices itself, knowing that it's like on the last of its legs, in order to try and save San when she becomes consumed by the demon and everything. And I found something like really interesting and cathartic, how like when you see the two wolves with them, they're truly the last of their kind. And I'm like, oh wow. And that's before we even get into the finale with the deer god and everything. And I wonder, and obviously what that symbolizes, because that's obviously just like nature coming back to bite humanity in its ass. But I was wondering if you kind of like what kind of like metaphors and allusions you picked up on there, as far as like, like what, when should we become aware? Like, when does the line cross, obviously, between like, what's called industrialism versus preserving what should be preserved, because obviously most of the time we as humans, we just keep barreling forward full steam ahead with no repercussion of the actions, but we don't realize that, we're kind of destroying these sacred things that, if we're not careful, we'll never come back, and most people kind of take that for granted, especially here in America. Like here in America, like we don't care,
I think it's just as bad over here in the UK. The one thing I did notice, actually, the fact that there's only these three wolves. Do you think that the three wolves maybe adopted Princess Mononoke as their own and claimed her to be the daughter?
Right.
Generally because there was like three of them, and they were like, okay, just something like that.
I could definitely see it as a situation, and again, I don't remember if they actually said this again. It was a long movie, to say the least, but I found it really interesting. I'm wondering if it was a situation where they ended up like killing her family, and then she was like, like the one survivor, like almost like almost like a Romulus / not Romulus and Remus, but like what's the Roman legend with the wolves that trained Romulus and Remus, kind of like that situation where it's like the wolves, they always see the helpless kid, and the whole thing is that they give the kid a chance because it's just a helpless kid, and rather than eat it, they see if it can grow up enough to defend itself. And I'm wondering if that was a situation, because again, for a primarily Eastern themed movie, there was a lot of Western themes in here that I found really interesting. And as far as, let's see. And as far as like, like the fight between the humans and animals, as far as like, the new emerging order, I kind of found that like the wolves, in addition to that, almost like kind of existed on the periphery, and specifically the lead wolf. Let me check her name right here, because again, there's so much detail in here. It's Moro. Yeah, Moro, the lead wolf, Moro. It was almost like she was kind of aware. I also kind of found it kind of really interesting how, even though it's supposed to be a female, it's clearly voiced by a guy. I just found that really funny. I loved how kind of they understood that they were like on their last legs, and that they were kind of like the last of its kind. I actually found that really interesting, like this really subliminal metaphor of how like, and what I found to be the prime difference between the wolves and the boars, because the boars were plentiful. So when they just full on charged into battle, they just, even though they knew they were marching towards certain defeat, they were like, it was like blinders on, it's like, screw it, there's plenty of us, there's no way they could possibly defeat all of us, and then they did. But the wolves almost had like this superior understanding of that. They're like, okay, there's much less of us. We'll fight when we have to, but if we don't have to, we're not going to, you know? And Moro, I specifically had that. So I found that like, that was another really interesting thing. It's like, oh, wow, that almost like shows the different levels of nature, you know, specifically between herbivores and carnivores, you know? It's like herbivores, there's so many of them that even though, you know, they run and scared, and even though the carnivores are technically dominant to them, there is still more of them. That's why the carnivores always have to be smarter, because if they're not careful, again, it's like the whole lion versus elephant thing. You know, it's like a lion goes after a gazelle, that's one thing, but a lion is smart enough to not go after an elephant, because otherwise it's going to get stomped on, you know? Yeah, so I found that really interesting too there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, bringing back to what you just said there, a lion, if it's going to take down an elephant, it's going to need multiple allies to help it out. But a simple gazelle or something, it can just take it down on its own.
Right. But the whole thing with nature too is that obviously like the fun comes from the hunt, you know, and that's the one thing that these wolves clearly do establish is even though they are sentient and even though they do communicate, they are still animals and they will still bite and eat and kill you, you know, as they say multiple times. They're like, you know, they're like, go home, boy, or else we're going to kill you and eat you, you know? And I can't tell. And it's like, I can't tell if they're joking in that scene, but I also don't want to know if they're joking because they probably will. And that's another thing too that I wanted to get to is that, again, for an animated movie, this movie's friggin' violent. Like, you see like limbs getting chopped off, you see heads getting blown up, you see piles and piles of carcasses. Like I have to assume that this was played for comedic effect, but you literally see Ashitaka like fire off multiple arrows and just knock people's heads clean off.
Oh, I mean, I remember when I saw that scene, I just could not stop laughing. I don't know if it was some kind of serious, epic, dramatic scene, but arrow decapitate the guy's head. I just lost it.
It kind of does take you out of the scene just a little bit, but I did like every time I saw that, I'm like, oh wow, this movie's not messing around. And what's funny is that for when I was watching this movie the second day, I was watching a couple scenes with my niece who's 2, and again, she can usually only focus for. Well, that's the thing. See, it's funny. Again, this is how I'm not irresponsible. I'm gonna come around on that. Is that she's 2, so she can usually only focus for like 10 minutes at a time, and then just wanders off and does something else. But I was very carefully making sure. I'm like, okay, no limb decapitation or anything in these scenes. Thank God, it was almost all primarily dialogue scenes. And ironically enough, after she left, that's when all the violence picked up again near the third act. I'm like, phew, dodged a bullet there. Yeah, dodged a bullet there. I mean, because you have kids, right? It's interesting too because. Yeah, because the whole thing, right, is that obviously everyone always assumes that, like, you know, animation, it's primarily a kid's medium. But, like, I've seen my fair share of animated movies. I'm like, yeah, I would never show this to a kid, you know? Like, the 80s dark movies, like the Don Bluth movies, those are kind of interesting because even though those have some very, like, darker overtones of shadows, the subject matter is still, for the most part, primarily kiddie fare. You know, like Land Before Time, that movie is very dark in look, but it doesn't, like, have anything that's inherently, like, bad for a kid. It might be, like, slightly scary when you're younger. Like, I remember the scene where they were all like covered in that goo was kind of scary, but that was about it, you know. But this movie, it's like, whoa, like I feel like kids would have to be like a certain level of maturity in order to appreciate this, and they wouldn't just be able to like watch this. You know? I mean, I don't know. It's weird. I'm kind of like in this 50-50 spot. What do you think?
I don't know, really, because one question I do have for you, actually. Okay, you know the film Watership Down?
Yes.
That's basically one of the most violent things I've ever seen in animation.
Right.
It had like a universal rating.
Yeah.
This one, as far as I'm concerned, has a PG rating. Would you say that's suitable for kids?
That's funny that you bring that up because that goes back to the whole thing in the 80s, right? Because the 80s was the decade that really solidified that. Because the whole thing is, I think that I don't remember for the longest time. I think the whole thing is, again, back in the day, I think it was just PG and X, right? I think the whole thing is that the R rating didn't come around until. I don't remember what the film was that determined the R rating, but the whole thing, right, is that it was just R and PG for the longest time. Like you had a movie like Spaceballs rated PG, you know, but the whole thing was that when Raiders of the Lost Ark and Scarface came out, those movies kind of differentiated where it's like, oh, okay, there should be a little bit more because again, the whole thing is that even though I guarantee you nobody complained about this, the whole face melting scene at the end, like the whole MPAA thing, we're like, okay, this is clearly is not PG, you know, but it's interesting because like I have seen animated and more like kiddie fare movies that are rated PG-13, but it's really interesting because I feel like each film is a unique case, right? And the funny thing is that even though there is violent and mature subject matter that comes into this movie, I don't think that I would be too uncomfortable showing this to somebody. Like I know a couple of 12 and 13-year-olds who would probably love something like this, you know? So I do think that it should be, but at the same time, I don't. So I'm kind of back and forth there. I'm kind of 50-50 there as far as that goes, you know, because again, each case is really subjective. And the problem is that even though I think the thing that it comes down to is that even though there is violence in this movie, it's not violence for the sake of violence. It's violence to show that this was the time period that it took place during. Again, like most Kurosawa movies, it takes place during the feudal Japan era. And again, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of samurai riding around. There was a lot of village conquering, you know, bigger tribes taking over smaller villages. There was a lot of just like very blatant violence, you know, a lot of bushido, a lot of seppuku, you know, lot of that kind of stuff. And the movie didn't shy away from it. And again, for an animated movie, I give this a lot of props. And in a way, I think this is actually why I like this movie more than Spirited Away, because Spirited Away, as crazy and as surreal as that movie got, it still was a kid's movie. You know, like Spirited Away never lost sight of what it was, which was a kid's movie. But this movie, to me, I don't know if it's just like the age where I'm at right now. Like I feel like if I watched the two movies when I was a lot younger, I would have liked Spirited Away more. But because I watched this movie now, like Spirited Away, I watched and I was like, okay, this is fun, you know, because like I said, the 80s dark fantasy genre was kind of hit or miss for me. But this movie I watched, I was like, whoa. Specifically when they got to that last act, when the deer god dies and it turns into that giant blob thing and just starts destroying everything. I'm like, holy shit. And like when they're racing to find the thing's head, I'm like, wow, I'm on the edge of my seat right now, more so than I have been for like most movies I've seen recently.
Yeah, it's like at that point, I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I saw this huge blob thing and I thought, hang on, this is just as bizarre as Spirited Away in some way.
Right. But in a different way too, because like that to me was the moment where it's like, okay, this is your, what's it called? This is your kind of nature finally taking revenge, right? Because that's the whole thing, is that even though you'd seen the fight between humans and nature for a majority of it, you didn't see nature like fully taking swing. You know, that's the whole thing, right? With Jurassic Park, is that Jurassic Park, you know, and that's the whole thing of what shows what happens when mankind attempts to meddle in nature and then nature bites back, you know? And the whole thing is with that movie kind of, again, the difference between that movie and this movie is that movie makes it the midpoint of the movie, you know, like the full moment, the oh shit moment when they realize that everything's screwed is that T-Rex moment, you know?
Well, yeah,
this movie kind of saves its cards for the end, because for the majority of the movie, humans are winning for better or for worse. You know, like first with right from the opening shot with Ashitaka killing the one demon boar that infects him at first, and then when he brokers the peace, you know, when San infiltrates the village in order to try and kill Lady Eboshi, and then he ends up bringing her out to the wolves, and then when and then obviously when the boars attack and everything, like the humans are winning, and they mess the animals up pretty badly. But it's not until Eboshi makes the one fatal mistake and kills the deer god right when it's in its weird rejuvenation stage. And that's the whole thing, is that the deer god is both the harbinger of life and death. And I find it funny that even though the animals are technically gods too, they don't really understand that. Like the boars go to, like when Okatu is like very, very grievously injured right before it becomes a demon and is going towards the deer god with the hopes that it'll resurrect his race, even though he's like so clearly delirious that it's like, dude, you clearly don't understand that that's not how this works. And then the deer god comes and almost like puts it out of his mercy, which is just like such a bleak scene in context, but it's still so beautiful to watch because it's so beautifully animated. And then when it's like extending its neck upwards and Eboshi shoots it, and I'm kind of hoping it's like, yes, she's missed. And then the head explodes and you see the bubble come out. I'm like, oh no. Like I was hoping.
Yeah, it's like you're actually rooting for the blob at this point. You actually want it to stop all these people.
Kind of, but again, it's continuing with this movie's moral areas where it's like, in theory, you're hoping, you're like, yes, come on, nature, go out and fuck over all these humans. But then you see what the blob actually does. And the blob is, again, at that point, it's just like, it's the whole thing of, right, like without consciousness, just pure unmoving force, which is that it's almost like the Terminator in a sense, you know? It doesn't really have thought or feeling. It doesn't care about anything. It's no longer a force of benevolence, it's just a force of destruction. You know, it's kind of like the opposite side of that coin. And when you see it moving out and just destroying and consuming everything, you know, we're talking the forest, the humans, everything, like everyone's running away from it, you know. It's almost kind of like, in a weird way, kind of like once and again, this is a really bad movie, but bear with me because I feel like this example does work. What's it called? Once Phoenix is officially unleashed at the end of Dark Phoenix, not Dark Phoenix, not that one. X-Men: The Last Stand, and she's just destroying everything in her path. Humans, mutants, it doesn't matter, you know. And the sad part is that again, you see the residents of the Ironworks, and again, it's not Eboshi or the spies or any of the people that directly attacked it. It's just like the regular people who were just defending themselves and just want a place to live. And you see all of them are about to get utterly demolished, and you realize, oh wait, there are no good or bad guys here. Like that stuff, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of stuff right there.
Yeah, it's pretty much demolish whatever's in your way at that point. It's like throughout the entire film, as you said before, the humans are winning. They're using all these different guns that they've invented, all these bombs in their arsenal. And then at the end, nature's like, you know what? Fuck it. I've got a much bigger weapon in my arsenal. Yeah. And here it is. You're all screwed now.
Especially, again, it's like once it's almost like once they remove the head, it's like the symbolic. It's like symbolically, it's like, okay, you've removed like the filter. Now you're just like, utter destruction. Yeah. It's like you just destroyed the only thing that was holding back the thing that would literally, destroy you completely, And I don't know, I don't know. Maybe this is just because I've seen this before, so this might be me nitpicking. But what is it with them using black ooze to symbolize like death and destruction? Because I'm like, did you kind of rip that off from Ferngully? Because Ferngully did the exact same thing with Hexus. The evil forest eater demon. I like this movie a lot more than Ferngully, but it's kind of hard to miss the similarities there as far as that goes.
I know. Since I've never seen that film. The only thing which I was picturing throughout the entire thing was it was like a Venom symbiote for some reason. That's what was running through my head.
Kind of, yeah. Where it's
evil. But anyway, so
yeah. The thing about the Venom symbiote is that it's kind of just like it just wants a host. It's just like the Venom symbiote is like a desperate person. It just wants somebody looking for a relationship. It just wants somebody else to latch onto. This is just like, oh man, I'm trying to think of like a good thing to compare it to. Just like that thing that just like destroys everything regardless of what's in its path. And I guess this is kind of like I kind of guess like it's that unstoppable force metaphor that the Joker uses in The Dark Knight. That's probably because that's like the only thing that I can think of as far as that goes. And I found that really interesting because again, it continues with Miyazaki's overall exploration of kind of using these very heightened fantastical ideas but keeping them on a very grounded level. It's what he did so well with Spirited Away. It didn't happen as much in The Wind Rises because The Wind Rises was for the most part like a straight biopic. It just had like a few surrealism edges like with the dreams and stuff. But again, I'm going to be very interested to see how that continues throughout the rest of his filmography, with films obviously like I want to hit Howl's Moving Castle. I know Grave of the Fireflies and Kiki's Delivery Service are also big ones. Are there any other ones that you could think of off the top of your head that you know of?
I have no idea now. Like my mind's gone a bit blank.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. But there's a few other themes that I just want to talk about. Oh, so this is interesting. So obviously the theme of duality being a pretty prevalent theme, the duality, and then obviously what's called the difference between individualism and social conformity. Those are two huge things, specifically you see that easily with San and Eboshi. The whole thing is San is very, very individualistic to the point where she often lets rational-minded thought, like rationality just go out the window and just her blind vendetta against Eboshi, who she clearly doesn't realize just like has this responsibility to look after the people in her town. But also the idea of duality where you have this Eboshi character where, again, to me, part of the charm of her is that even though what she's doing is wrong, in a way she kind of doesn't really understand in a way what just the amount of harm that she is causing to this, because again her only focus is the residents of her village, and I found that really fascinating. Again, it's what makes to me Eboshi like just a really fascinating character and not just like a generic antagonist. If anything, it kind of made me even more sad when she took the shot at the deer god. I'm like, no, don't. You're so much better than this, Eboshi. You're so much better than this.
Yeah, you just want one redeeming quality. When she decapitates the spirit god's head, it's like, nah, that's out the window. But a question I do have for you as well. Of what we talked about throughout this entire thing, like who do you root for, the humans or the animals?
Oh,
do you think that the spirit of the forest symbolizes that both of them are not very different? Because if you look at the spirit's face, it's kind of like a human face with like a deer sort of body. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that one.
Oh, that's a good pull. That's a good pull because, oh my God, I wasn't even thinking about that too. That's a crazy thing because literally, you know what's funny? Oh my, I should have known that too because the whole thing with me when I saw that, I was like, what is up with that deer's face? But I thought it was interesting too. And I don't know if you picked up on this, like when you had like the regular, like the close-ups of the deer's face, like looking at it like this, like symmetrically head on, it looked kind of flat. But then when you saw the shot from the side, it kind of looked more extended and animalistic. And that was definitely an intentional choice, like kind of showing like, the different sides between humans and animals and like showing that, you know, they're not that different. But that's really, really interesting that you pointed that out because is the answer to that question. Like it's the whole underlying theme of the movie is the idea that because humans, that's the whole thing that we've talked about a lot, is that because humans are not actually that different from animals, the whole thing is that they're just kind of slightly more elevated because they've reached this level of cognitive thinking that animals just didn't, you know, just based on evolution, you know. But that's so interesting and fascinating that you bring that up. Wow. Like, I feel like Joe Rogan right now, just no response. Is just like, wow, you hit the nail on the freaking head right there. I think you just solved like the entire theme of the movie.
Oh, you reckon?
Yeah, I do reckon.
They got deserve man points for that one.
Yeah, definitely. I really don't know what else we can talk about as far as that. Like, we pretty much picked this to death. But Jesus, like, oh man, what a movie! That is all that I have to say. Like, I'm really glad that you pointed out the idea of this being like just an animated movie that automatically made your favorites. Like, because the whole thing is that I'm still trying to figure out my top 20 movies of all time, and Toy Story and Lion King were the Toy Story and Lion King were the only two animated movies that I had in there. But after I saw this movie, first of all, not only is this movie probably going to make my favorite movies of the year that I was born, 97, I'm also just so happy that this movie came out in 97. I feel like that's what like gives this an extra level above it too. But this movie automatically is making my top 20. And the more I think about it, this honestly might make my top 10. Like it really might. Like this movie for an animated movie. And again, we really have to stop doing that because we have to stop automatically discrediting animated movies as not
for real.
Like, being to the caliber of live action films, because almost every single animated movie that I've seen has been on the caliber of live action films, if not more. And there's a reason for that. You know, it has a level of thought and creativity that is put into the stories that I just don't see from live action. And again, maybe you can help me out with this, because this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to get into is why is it that for a medium where you know that your brain recognizes that it is watching drawings or CG animation or, you know, whatever they're animated for, you know, stop motion is usually easier to get across because at the very least your brain can register that you're watching actual objects moving. How is it that they're able to sell stories that are sometimes more legitimately humane than actual like human stories about like real human characters? You know, is it the whole personification angle? Is that it? You know, us transcribing human traits to these inhumane objects?
I was about to say that, yeah, because if you really think about it, someone in a room sat there with a pencil and paper, and they're like, okay, if I'm going to make this as real and humane as possible, I've got to put some real work into this. And it's a lot faster, and it's a lot faster just to write a script and get someone just to read it out to you, like make them wear a costume and stuff. But to do that, if you want to make it as real and as good as possible, you need to put the time and effort into it. So, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, just because I'm obviously, again, I'm a huge proponent of animated movies. I found that, like, as I've gotten older, again, I'm wearing a freaking Lion King shirt. Ironically enough, I finally actually wore the right shirt for the right occasion. But I just found that, like, the more and more I go back to these animated movies, I just find myself liking them so much more now, you know, just for the behind the scenes, you know, appreciation that I've garnered from learning about the behind the scenes of the filmmaking process and everything. And it just makes me have so much more appreciation. I'm like, wow, like I have to imagine that like the amount of time that it takes to like make just like a regular film, it takes like at least double the time to make an animated film, you know, with the story conception, actually getting the script written, then just for like designing the idea of what the world is going to look like, because that has to be designed entirely from scratch, getting the original cells drawn, you know, and then once you add the CG on top of it, because again, this was the latest in the trend of a couple of 90s films that were introducing additional 3D scopes on top of traditional hand-drawn animation. You know, ironically enough, Rescuers Down Under, which to me does not get nearly enough credit, kind of kicked off that trend. Right. And you would see that utilized in the rest of the big Disney films throughout the 90s, but you also saw it used here. Like there were a couple of shots where they used 3D landscaping, and it actually provided like a lot of interesting textures too. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff, man. It really
is. Stuff, yeah. I mean, I think what gets me down about animation and why so many people discredit it as well, particularly adults. Like an adult will look at a piece of animation and go, "Oh, it's cartoon. It's for kids. I'm not going to bother with it." And I think that's a shame because since I've gotten into anime, since the first time I popped Death Note on to the point I'm at now, I've watched a shit ton of anime now, and I love it. I mean, I've fallen in love with this genre. It's just so good. And if more people just look past the fact that it's just a cartoon character, that cartoon character has a real persona behind them. And I think if more people see that, then the studio could grow even more.
Because the whole thing is that with the idea of seeing a regular person, you know, it's obviously the person has to make you fall in love with the character, but it's already kind of that much easier because at the very least, even if you don't like the person, your brain still registers that it's a real life person. When you're watching an animated character, your brain has to, just from like what the brain does in its perception of art and media, your brain has to do double the work just to convince itself that you're watching a real person. And the fact that these characters usually so seamlessly, even though there's usually, you know, human voices coming out of it, you still register that you're watching a hand-drawn or a CG animated character on a computer. And the fact that these characters still can appear so humane, you know, and the fact that we can just fall in love with them so much more as a result of it, it's just there really is a specialty to it. And the fact that animation gets discredited as just for kids, to me, is just abhorrent. I'm going to use that word, abhorrent. Yeah. Yeah. But this has been a great conversation. But so, yeah, just to wrap it up, because we kind of got away from it a little bit. Yeah, Princess Mononoke is an absolutely perfect film. To quote myself in my review that I wrote for it last night, the Miyazaki streak of perfection continues. With The Wind Rises, Miyazaki told a perfect animated biopic with a dash of surrealism. With Spirited Away, he did his best take on an 80s dark fantasy. And in this film, he does his best take on a Kurosawa film with a fantasy twist. But it is just unbelievable. It's got some of the most jaw-dropping animation I've ever seen. It statements on the plight between humans and nature is actually adds something new to the conversation with what I thought was a kind of tired out and it's quite frankly overdone story that really had nothing left to offer. And the fact that this actually gave me something new to offer was impressive enough. I love the characters, all of the characters too, like every single one. Like I don't think there was a single character in this movie that I didn't like.
Yeah, they're all great.
Yeah, and just this is a perfect movie. I'm gonna say it. Yeah, this is an absolutely perfect movie, and this is 5 stars for me. Absolutely.
And a solid 5 from me too. Like, there's nothing about it. Awesome film. I absolutely loved it, and I could see myself watching it again and again. And The Wind Rises is something I've never seen, so I think that's up next for me. I'll check it out. Yeah, The Wind Rises is a good one. I'm really glad that I made that my first one overall. You know, it's a very quiet film, and again, for an animated movie, it is a very, very human movie. You know, that's probably like the first animated movie where like there's no like exaggerated like facial expressions, there's no like crazy actions or anything like that where it's like, okay, they could never get away with that in real life. Like it feels very, very human. Like I said, it's a biopic and it feels more realistic than like most of the actual biopics. You know, like I buy The Wind Rises more than I do something like Bohemian Rhapsody, you know, so there's something there as far as that goes. But Jimbob, thanks again for being on. Again, our Studio Ghibli streak continues. As soon as we watch the next one, we'll have you back. It's funny because we were originally supposed to have Wonder Woman in this spot, and then, you know, Wonder Woman got pushed back because obviously, unfortunately, by the time this episode comes out, I'll just break the news to you now. Dune is the latest film. Denis Villeneuve's Dune is the latest film to get pushed back. It's been delayed to October of 2021 now. Yep. So that's the next one. So that's Dune. To be honest. That's Dune, Black Widow, and No Time to Die that have now all been delayed to next year. So that leaves Soul and Wonder Woman as far as like the big animated releases. Free Guy is still sticking to that December release spot, but I'm not confident. I'm not confident at all as far I'm not holding any hope for it, but you know, we'll see what happens.
I mean, you obviously, you as a Brit too, obviously, like with the whole Bond thing, you know, that's got to be a blow right there.
If I'm being honest with you, like I never actually was a huge fan of James Bond. Like I only started watching the Daniel Craig films. If I'm being honest, this year,
I kind of love that too because like mostly, I think you're like the first Brit that I've met who's like not huge into Bond. I actually kind of love that too. We'll have to get into that later on in a different podcast.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and but yeah. So with that being said, Jimbob, where can the good people find you online?
Okay, guys. So if you want any like R-rated content, not in terms of like blood and violence, but in terms of like the jokes and the gross sort of humor, go to Jimbob Talks Movies. It's right there.
Awesome. I love it. Oh, that's great. Jimbob, you were a blast. Thanks again for being on. And I am, of course, Dom, the movie nerd of Talkin TV. Chris, the TV nerd, could unfortunately not be here because we lead busy lives in our real life people. But that's not going to stop us from getting you guys quality content. If you click in the description below, you'll see all of our playlists. You can click the subscribe button. You can click the like button. You can click the little bell. That way you get notified every time we put up new content. Guys, we've been putting up a lot of content. And even though it's the second half of the year, and even though we're finally getting this goddamn stupid, awful quarantine year over with, we'll see what next year brings us, but we're still not going to stop giving you guys content because we've got lots of content to give, and we're both trying to be as creative as possible. We've got content every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. New podcast episodes are out on Wednesdays. We've usually got Chris's Lovecraft Country recap series still airing on Mondays. We've got a new episode up that aired last night on Tuesday, and we have 2 more episodes left of that. We're continuing our Shocktober event. We'll be continuing that this weekend with viewing of Candyman on David of Flix Talks channels. That's going to be a lot of fun. Keep tuned to the channel in order to see more updates on that as we go throughout the month of October. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram at Talkin TV. Again, all the links will be in the description. Follow this man right here because he's awesome and he knows a lot and he's really fun to have around. And of course, people, as always, watch more fucking movies. We out.